Hey, welcome back everybody. What we're going to talk about today is those pieces of dietary advice that really just do not help you lose weight. And we've all heard these, and it sounds very reasonable, but unfortunately, they just don't work. We're going to go through the 3 least helpful pieces of advice. And that's coming right up. Number 3, choose the best diet for you. So if we can't even agree on what constitutes a good diet, how are you supposed to choose the best diet for you? If you think about the dietary advice we've given out over the years, it constantly changes. So in the 50s and 60s, you had your grandmother telling you what to eat. And what you ate really depended on your nationality. So the Irish would eat certain things, the English would eat certain things, the Chinese would eat certain things, and so on. So different ethnic groups had different foods, and they all maintained a fairly good weight. Once we got into the 70s and 80s, we changed because the government decided to tell us to eat a very low-fat diet. So we ate lots of things like white bread and jam and cookies and pasta. Unfortunately, it may have led to an increase in the national rates of obesity. By the 90s, we're starting to backtrack as we started to realize that fatty foods such as nuts and salmon and avocados and olive oil could be a very healthy part of the diet. So people started to talk about healthy fats. So you see that things are always changing. So if the experts can't even agree on what the best dietary advice is, how are you supposed to do it for yourself? It's like saying if you have cancer, you go to your cancer specialist and your specialist says, choose the best chemotherapy for you. It's just not that useful advice. The best diet is the diet you can follow. Well, again, it gives you no advice as to what is good and what is bad if you're trying to lose weight. That is to say, if the diet I can follow is McDonald's and pizza, well, it's not a very healthy diet and it's probably not going to make me lose weight. So the best diet is not the one you can follow. There are certain specific guidelines as to what makes foods healthy and what makes foods fattening. And we need to know what they are, not this advice to choose the best diet for you or the best diet is the one you can follow. That's just not useful advice. Number 2, in terms of least useful advice, eat everything in moderation. This is based on the assumption that essentially all foods are equal, but not all foods are equally fattening. So therefore, some foods you should eat more of and some foods you should eat less of. And that's just common sense. For example, you wouldn't say, oh, you really need to go easy on that kale. And hey, lighten up on that broccoli. Because almost nobody gets fat eating kale. So you don't really need to moderate that. On the other hand, if you're talking about cookies and sugary drinks, well, yes, they do tend to be fattening, and therefore you should cut them back not just to moderation, but you should really restrict them to as little as you can if you're trying to lose weight. So the advice to eat everything in moderation is a very evasive answer. It doesn't really address the complexity of how humans gain and lose weight. Some foods are more fattening than others. Some drinks you need to cut back on, sugary sodas, juices for example. But other drinks like green tea, you don't need to cut back on it. You don't need to drink them in moderation. It's not going to make you gain weight. If you look at other diseases, for example, heart disease, we know there are certain things that raise your risk of heart disease, smoking for example. So you wouldn't say, well, it's okay to smoke as long as you do it in moderation. We know that smoking is bad, so therefore we ask people that they should cut it out entirely. And it's the same with foods. You need to know which foods are going to be really good for you and which ones are going to be really bad for you. So to say eat everything in moderation is simply a cop-out. and it's not helpful at all. The number one least useful advice for losing weight is cut your calories, eat less, and move more. So this one sounds very reasonable, and in fact, it's what everybody has been taught. It's what I was taught in medical school all those years ago, that if people simply eat fewer calories than they expend, that they will automatically lose weight. Unfortunately, that's not quite true. Calories is essentially a unit of food energy, and our bodies can use the energy in different ways. And how it uses the energy, whether it stores it as body fat or whether we use it for moving around or generating body heat, it depends on the hormones that those foods elicit. So more important than that is, does this advice actually work in the real world? Because it doesn't matter why you think it may or may not work. The question is, does it work? In this study, they looked at the real world efficacy of that advice. It was a 10-year study. They looked at the records from family practices all over the United Kingdom. And they looked at the probability of an obese person attaining normal body weight. And this was predominantly using advice such as eat fewer calories, because that is a standard advice that virtually all doctors and dietitians and most everybody else gives you too. So here's the results of their study. So here's what they found. If you take the best case scenario and you look at men and women who are just over the body mass index of 30, which is 30 to 35, which is considered obese, and normal body mass index is up to 25. What you can see is that the probability of becoming normal weight after 10 years with this standard advice is only 1 in 210. For women, it's 1 in 124. That equals a success rate of 0.5 to 0.8%. In other words, in the real world, the advice to simply cut your calories has about a 99.2 to 99.5% rate of failure. In other words, virtually nobody is able to lose weight in this way. The question is, why would we give advice where we know the failure rate is so incredibly high? It makes no sense. So regardless of whether you think it should or shouldn't work, the bottom line is that it doesn't work in the real world. So it's not just the research that tells us this, but also everybody knows that it doesn't work. In fact, that's why doctors have basically given up the field to Weight Watchers or Jenny Craig or some of these other companies, because they know that the advice that they give almost never results in people losing weight. And everybody's tried it, yet it doesn't work for anybody. So the research and people's own experiences in this case are telling us the same thing. It doesn't work. And there's two possibilities why this advice to cut your calories doesn't work. Either the advice is good, but people are not following it. In other words, the nutritional authorities want to say that it's really your fault. The advice is good, but you can't follow it. The other possibility, which is very rarely considered, is that the advice is just not good. But here's something you always have to consider. If we've been telling people for the last 40 to 50 years to simply cut their calories and you'll lose weight, if this were really good advice, we wouldn't have an epidemic of obesity. And yet, since the 1970s, what we've seen is this explosion of people who have gained weight. But the advice has not been able to help them. So what determines whether or not you gain weight? Well, it really comes down to three questions. And it's the same if you're talking about money, for example. It depends, what are you making? Is it US dollars or ounces of gold, for example? How much are you making? Are you making 1? Are you making 10? or 1,000? And how often are you making it? Do you make it every day? Do you make it once a week or once a year? Because all of those factors are going to be important. When you're talking about weight, it depends on what types of food you're eating, because some foods are fattening and some foods are not. So what you want to do is cut down those foods, the sugary foods, and also a lot of the refined foods and refined carbohydrates. Second thing is, how much are you eating? And a lot of people think that this is the major thing, but how much you eat actually depends on your hormones, because we have hormones that tell us to stop eating. They're called satiety hormones. When we eat too much, we get full and we want to stop eating. So the key here is not to count, but to really eat natural, unprocessed foods so that those natural signals to stop eating are there. A lot of the refined foods get rid of all these natural satiety signals, and therefore we're very prone to overeating them. And the third question is, how often are you eating? Are you eating once a day or 6 to 8 times a day? Because if you're eating 6 to 8 times a day, then you're going to have a lot more to deal with in terms of food energy. Your body's going to want to store it because that's what you're telling the body to do. So this gets back to the other video that I did, which is the 5-step weight loss solution, which attacks all of these things. What to eat? Well, cut down sugars, cut down refined foods, moderate protein, don't fear the natural fats. How much to eat? Well, eat natural unprocessed foods, and you'll naturally eat to satiety. And how often to eat? Don't eat all the time. And those are going to be the keys to weight loss. And all of those questions are important, so you can't ignore any one of those. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this or you learned something from this video, make sure you hit the like button and maybe share it with your friends. Bye, everybody.